I remember the sound of the bathroom door opening before I even saw who it was. And I remember the instant my life shifted in a direction I never imagined. At that point, everything in my home felt predictable, routine, and numb. I had been married for 12 years, and somewhere along that timeline, affection turned into obligation, and conversation turned into silence. My husband wasn't unkind. He was just absent. Even when he sat beside me, he felt worlds away. Work, meetings, late nights, trips, there was always something more pressing than us. I learned to live with the distance, convincing myself it was normal, that all long marriages eventually drifted into quiet companionship. Then my nephew arrived unexpectedly to stay with us for a while. His parents were dealing with things out of state, and our home was the easiest place for him to land. I didn't give it much thought at first. He was family, polite, respectful, reserved, but he brought an energy I had forgotten existed. He greeted me every morning with sincerity, asked how my day was going, actually listened to the answer. He noticed when I seemed tired and when I tried to hide it. It was unsettling how foreign that kind of attention had become to me. The first few days I told myself I was just tired. Marriage had worn me thin, life had worn me down. But the truth was simpler. I had grown invisible inside my own home, and his presence made me aware of it. He thanked me for meals my husband barely acknowledged. He offered to help with groceries, dishes, repairs. I laughed for the first time in months over something small he said in the hallway. And that moment stayed with me longer than it should have. I didn't recognize what was happening at first. I only knew that when my husband brushed past me without noticing, I felt hollow. And when my nephew asked if I was all right, I felt seen. I tried to ignore the shift. I told myself it was innocent, ordinary, harmless. But loneliness has a way of clouding judgment, blurring boundaries, and making weaknesses feel like connections. The quiet in my marriage became heavier, and the warmth in his presence became harder to ignore. I noticed myself choosing words more carefully around him, smoothing my appearance just slightly, hiding exhaustion instead of displaying it. I hated that I cared. I hated that I felt different. But what I hated more was how unnoticed I had become long before he stepped through our front door. I thought I had accepted the silence inside my marriage. I thought nothing could ever wake me from it. I was wrong. And in that slow, subtle shift, the foundations of my loyalty began to tremble in ways I wasn't prepared to confront. He began settling into the house quietly, almost carefully, as if he didn't want to disrupt anything. I appreciated that more than I admitted. He picked up chores without being asked, and every time he did, I felt a strange discomfort, like he was unintentionally exposing how neglected my efforts had become. My husband barely noticed the difference, too preoccupied with emails and deadlines to acknowledge the shift in atmosphere. What surprised me was how naturally conversations with my nephew unfolded. They started brief and harmless. How was work? How was school? But over the next few days, they deepened in ways I didn't anticipate. He asked questions no one had asked me in years, questions that required thought, memory, honesty. I found myself sharing pieces of my life I'd forgotten were still buried inside me. Dreams I'd abandoned quietly, moments of disappointment I never spoke of, fears I had grown accustomed to carrying alone. He listened without judgment, without impatience, without distraction. Something in me responded to that. It was unsettling to feel understood so easily, so unexpectedly. I tried to convince myself it was simply comforting to be heard. But comfort, when starved, can become dangerous without warning. Late evenings turned into longer conversations, and I began anticipating them. I noticed the time when he'd come home, and I waited for the chance to talk, pretending it was coincidence. He spoke about his life openly, sincerely, and trusting me came naturally to him. That trust became a mirror reflecting how far I had drifted from emotional closeness in my marriage. I didn't intend to lean on him emotionally, but intentions rarely matter when the heart finds a void to fill. Guilt began creeping in quietly, like a shadow at the edge of something fragile. I caught myself thinking about our conversations long after they ended, replaying moments where he had looked at me with genuine concern. I knew it shouldn't matter. I knew I shouldn't rely on it. And still, I waited for it. Some evenings, when my husband came home late and collapsed onto bed without a word, I found myself lingering in the quiet of the living room, knowing I wasn't entirely alone. The contrast was sharp, undeniable, painful. My nephew wasn't trying to replace anything. He wasn't pursuing anything inappropriate. He was simply present. Yet presence itself became temptation, not by action but by kindness. I started fearing the warmth I felt around him, not because of anything he did, but because of how starved I had been for warmth in the first place. That I kept telling myself boundaries still existed. I repeated it like a mantra, hoping it would anchor me. But emotional distance from my husband had turned into emotional vulnerability, and vulnerability seeks connection instinctively. I began realizing the danger wasn't something dramatic. It was something simple, something quiet, something soft. The kind of shift that happened slowly and visibly until you can't remember when it began, only when you noticed it was already too late. That morning began like any other, marked by routine and silence. My husband left early without much more than a brief goodbye, already focused on whatever awaited him outside our home. The weight of the previous weeks lingered heavily, and I stepped into the shower hoping the water would quiet the thoughts that had been crowding my mind. I needed a moment away from everything. Away from guilt, away from confusion, away from the pull I couldn't fully explain. I wasn't expecting anything unusual to happen. I thought I had control of the situation, of myself, of the emotions I kept insisting were harmless. The door opened quickly and without warning. I heard the startled gasp before I even processed what was happening. The shock hit both of us instantly. He froze, realizing too late that the bathroom wasn't empty, and I reacted instinctively, yelling his name in disbelief. He apologized immediately and backed out, shutting the door so fast it rattled the frame. It happened in seconds, and yet those seconds felt unnervingly long. My heart pounded hard enough to drown out every rational thought. It wasn't the intrusion itself that terrified me. It was what stood behind it. I stood there trembling, overwhelmed by a wave of embarrassment, fear, and realization. I hadn't done anything wrong. He hadn't intended anything inappropriate. And yet the moment exposed everything I had been trying to ignore. The emotional closeness, the quiet dependency, the unspoken pull between comfort and danger. All of it collided at once, leaving no room for denial. That accidental moment forced me to confront a truth I had been avoiding. Feelings, once awakened, don't disappear just because boundaries are unspoken. I kept thinking about how innocent the situation was, how accidental, how harmless. But the effect was the opposite. I felt exposed in every way, not physically but emotionally. I couldn't hide behind excuses anymore. I couldn't pretend things were normal. And I couldn't dismiss the connection I had allowed to form. Shame settled heavily on my chest, not because of what happened in that instant, but because of what had been building long before it. For the rest of that day, we avoided each other awkwardly. Every footstep in the hallway felt heavy. Every word was stiff and measured. His repeated apologies were sincere and uncomfortable, and I could barely meet his eyes. The air felt charged with a discomfort neither of us knew how to ease. I realized I was the one who needed distance, not from him as a person, but from the way he made me feel seen. The incident wasn't the beginning of anything forbidden. It was a warning that I was standing on the edge of something I had no right to approach. That realization lingered louder than the mistake itself. I understood then that temptation doesn't always come through intention. Sometimes it arrives through coincidence, revealing a truth you were unprepared to face. And standing there afterward, wrapped in a towel and trembling, I understood with painful clarity that the situation had become something I could no longer minimize, excuse, or ignore. The hours after that incident changed something in me. I couldn't continue pretending there was nothing dangerous about the closeness we had allowed to grow. I kept replaying the moment in my mind, not because of the mistake itself, but because of what it revealed about the state of my marriage, my loneliness, and my vulnerability. I avoided him for most of the day, not out of anger, but because I didn't trust the emotional confusion building inside me. Every glance felt too heavy, every silence too meaningful. I realized I was frightened of how easily comfort can become temptation when affection is missing at home. That he apologized again that evening, with genuine remorse in his eyes. He insisted he had no intention of crossing any boundary and respected me deeply. His sincerity made the situation even more painful, because it confirmed what I already knew. He hadn't been the problem. The problem was the space within me that I had allowed to go unguarded. I reassured him it was all right, but the words felt fragile, barely holding back guilt. I didn't know what to do with the emotions I had awakened unintentionally. My husband, unaware of anything that had occurred, continued with his routine as if nothing in our world was shifting beneath the surface. His lack of awareness was louder than silence. I wanted him to see me, to notice the changes, to sense the distance, but he simply didn't. For the first time in years, I truly acknowledged how deeply our marriage had fractured. It wasn't a sudden break. It was the outcome of years of emotional erosion. As days passed, I started pulling back deliberately. I limited conversations, kept interactions minimal, and created space that hadn't existed before. It hurt more than I expected. Not because of him, but because it forced me to confront what I had been missing for so long. Emotional closeness, attention, acknowledgement. Things I didn't realize I needed until they were offered innocently. When his stay eventually came to an end, I felt an unsettling mix of relief and sorrow. Watching him leave made the house feel heavier, quieter, colder, and painfully familiar. That moment forced me to examine my marriage honestly. I knew something had to change. Staying distant, dormant, and quietly miserable wasn't sustainable. I didn't want to be someone who let emotional emptiness lead her into something irreversible. I needed to reclaim boundaries, responsibility, and clarity. I approached my husband weeks later, not with accusations but with honesty. I told him we had grown apart. I told him I felt invisible. I told him the silence between us had become unbearable. Whether we repaired the marriage or chose to part, the truth had finally been spoken. I learned that infidelity doesn't begin with betrayal. It begins with neglect. It begins quietly, through absence and silence, through needs ignored and feelings dismissed. I promised myself that I would never again let loneliness steer my heart blindly. What happened taught me that emotional attention, when misplaced, can become more dangerous than any physical act. And facing that truth became the first step toward reclaiming my life, before a line was crossed that neither of us could undo.